On a gray Tuesday morning in late October, the city moved in its usual restless rhythm. Buses sighed at every corner, motorbikes wove through tight gaps in traffic, and a light drizzle left everything with the dull shine of wet concrete. Somewhere between the chaos of the avenues and the quiet of the side streets, Daniel Reed sat alone at his small kitchen table, staring into a coffee that had already gone lukewarm. He had woken up at 5:30, as he had every morning for years, even though he no longer had a reason to. His body still held the memory of early shifts, urgent calls and sirens at dawn. His mind, however, remembered something else, a single night, a single call, that had rewritten everything. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the roughness of stubble. His apartment in the city was clean, almost obsessively so. The kind of neatness that didn't come from joy or pride, but from a quiet attempt to control at least one small corner of the universe. The walls were plain. A few framed photos sat on a shelf, colleagues in uniforms, an ambulance parked under streetlights, a blurry shot of a night shift crew laughing at something just outside the frame. Daniel barely looked at those anymore. He grabbed his mug, took a mechanical sip, and winced at the taste. Cold, stale. He stood up, emptied the coffee into the sink, and turned on the faucet, listening to the rush of water. For a brief moment, he rested his hands on the edge of the counter and stared at the stainless steel basin, as if the swirling coffee might reveal something. He knew it wouldn't. He had quit being a paramedic 6 years ago. People who met him now knew him as the quiet guy who sometimes worked part-time at a logistics warehouse, who helped his neighbor carry groceries, who always held the elevator door. They had no idea who he used to be. They had no idea what he carried. Sometimes, when the city got just quiet enough and the sirens in the distance sounded a certain way, sharp, urgent, with that rising pitch that meant someone was balancing on the thin line between life and death, his chest tightened. Memories didn't come in carefully arranged sequences. They came like flashes. The inside of an ambulance, the weight of a trauma bag on his shoulder, blood on his gloves, the tremor in someone's voice when they asked him, "Will they be okay?" And one specific face. He pushed the thought away, as he'd done 1,000 times. He dried the mug, placed it back in the cabinet, and forced himself into the rest of his morning. By late morning, Daniel found himself outside, walking without clear direction. It was his day off. The sky was still overcast, that indecisive kind of weather that couldn't commit to rain or sun. He walked past storefronts, listened to the muffled conversation spilling from cafes and barber shops, and tried not to notice how many people seemed connected to others, arms linked, laughing, leaning close. He didn't have many people left. A few former colleagues still texted every now and then, checking in. Most of the time he left the messages on read, struggling to find the right words that would explain, without really explaining, why he never came to gatherings anymore. He turned a corner and saw the cafe. It was a small place tucked between a bookstore and a laundromat. He'd passed it before but never gone in. Today, without thinking too much, he pushed the door open. A bell chimed overhead, a warm contrast to the damp air outside. Inside, the cafe was all soft lighting and low chatter, the smell of roasted coffee beans blending with something sweet. Cinnamon, maybe. He joined the short line and glanced at the blackboard menu. His eyes slipped over the fancy options and landed on the simplest choice, black coffee. When it was his turn, the barista, a young woman with tired eyes and a genuine smile, asked his name for the order. "Daniel," he said. The name felt heavier some days than others. He paid, stepped aside, and waited near the pickup counter. He barely noticed the people around him, a man working on a laptop, a woman reading a paperback, 2 teenagers sharing a pair of earbuds and laughing at something on a phone screen. "Daniel," the barista called. He stepped forward, took the cup, and looked for a place to sit. A small table near the window was empty. He made his way there, sat down, and wrapped his hands around the warmth of the paper cup. Outside, pedestrians moved under umbrellas, the world continuing in its indifferent way. He took a sip. This coffee was hot, strong, almost harsh on his tongue. Good. From where he sat, he could see his own reflection faintly in the glass. Mid-30s now, lines forming at the edges of his eyes, a jaw that seemed tenser than it used to be. There was a tiredness in his expression he couldn't quite soften, no matter how much he tried to relax his face. He let out a slow breath and tried not to think. But the thing about silence and stillness is that they offer too much space for the past to speak. His mind drifted back, as it always did, to the life he had built before everything collapsed. Years earlier, being a paramedic had been more than a job to Daniel. It had been a calling. He remembered his first day in the ambulance, heart racing with a mixture of fear and purpose. He had ridden alongside veterans who seemed to carry the weight of the city on their shoulders with calm competence. He learned from them, copied the way they spoke to patients, the way they moved quickly but not carelessly, the way they could crack a joke in the middle of a tense scene, not out of disrespect but out of some strange, shared understanding that sometimes humor was a lifeline. He had been proud of the uniform, of the patches on his sleeve, of the way people's eyes filled with relief when they saw the flashing lights and heard the siren approaching. He had gone home exhausted, hands still smelling faintly of antiseptic, clothes clinging with the faint odor of smoke or sweat, sometimes blood. But he had slept the sleep of a man who felt that, in some small way, he was holding the world together. There had been tough calls, of course. Some ended in tears, in silence, in the stillness of a heart that would not start again no matter how many compressions, how much air, how many pleas. He had learned early on that they couldn't save everyone. He had told himself that as long as he did everything right, as long as he followed protocol, as long as he stayed focused, he could live with the calls that didn't go their way. He had almost believed it, until the night that proved him wrong. The rain had been heavier that night. Not a drizzle, but a downpour that turned streets into slick ribbons and headlights into blurred halos. Daniel and his partner, Marcos, had been 3 hours into a night shift when the radio crackled to life. The dispatcher's voice came through, clipped and urgent, reciting an address and a few words that made Daniel's stomach clench. Male, mid-20s, possible cardiac arrest, CPR in progress, caller is family. Marcos met his eyes for a fraction of a second, then turned the siren on, weaving through traffic with practiced precision. Daniel opened the trauma bag, counting supplies as if the familiar motions could steady his heart. Oxygen mask, bag valve mask, IV sets, monitor leads. The address wasn't far, but to Daniel every red light felt like eternity. They pulled up to a small building on a quiet street. The front door was already open. As they grabbed their equipment and stepped inside, they heard it. The sound of someone sobbing, someone begging, someone counting compressions out loud, with a voice that broke on every number. "In here, please, hurry!" They followed the voice into a modest living room. There, on the floor, a young man lay on his back, shirt open, skin pale and slick with sweat. A woman around 50 knelt beside him, pushing down on his chest with frantic, uneven force. Beside her stood a young man who looked almost exactly like the patient, same dark hair, same jawline, same shape of the eyes, but his face was twisted with panic, the twin. Daniel didn't know that yet, but he saw the resemblance immediately. "We've got it," Daniel said, his voice firm. "Ma'am, step back. You've done a good job. Let us take over." The mother moved aside, hands shaking, sobbing. "Please, don't let him die. Please, he's my boy. He's my boy." Daniel swapped in for chest compressions while Marcos set up the bag valve mask and fitted it over the patient's face. The young man's chest rose and fell with each squeeze of the bag, but his eyes were closed, his body unresponsive. "What's his name?" Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice calm and clear. "Ethan," the brother answered. His voice was hoarse, as if he'd been shouting. He just collapsed. He said he couldn't breathe, and then he fell, and Okay, Ethan, Daniel said, directing his words at the man on the floor even though he didn't respond. "Stay with us, Ethan. We're here now. We've got you." He spoke to patients, even unresponsive ones, as if they could hear him. It was a habit he'd picked up from an older paramedic on one of his first calls. It made him feel like he wasn't just working on a body, but on a person. It reminded him that every movement, every decision, mattered. They attached the monitor leads. The screen flashed, then settled into a horrifying pattern. A chaotic, disorganized rhythm that wasn't really a rhythm at all. "VFib," Marcos said, eyes scanning the screen. "Charging." Daniel kept compressions going, counting in his head, feeling his own pulse pounding in his ears. The world shrank down to the space between his hands and Ethan's chest. The faint squeak of the CPR board against the floor, the beeping of the monitor. "Charged," Marcos said. "Clear." Daniel lifted his hands. The brother started to step forward. "Don't touch him," Daniel said sharply. "Everyone back." He watched as Ethan's body jolted slightly with the shock. The smell of ozone mixed with sweat and fear. "Resume compressions," Marcos said, and Daniel's hands went back to work. The minutes stretched. They tried everything. Another shock. Medication. Airway support. Daniel felt his arms burning, his shoulders aching, but he didn't slow down. He could hear the mother praying in a cracked whisper. He could hear the brother alternating between pleading and shouting. "Come on, Ethan! Don't do this, man, please!" At one point, the mother grabbed Daniel's sleeve. "You're not going to give up, right?" she asked, eyes red, voice shaking. "You won't stop?" Daniel met her gaze for a brief second, and something in his chest tightened. He knew the protocols. He knew the statistics. He knew that at a certain point the chances of bringing someone back dropped to almost nothing. But looking at her, he also knew that nothing he could say would make sense if the end result was the same. "We're doing everything we can," he said. "We're not giving up." He meant it. But after what felt like an eternity of compressions, shocks, and drugs, the monitor's line remained flat. No matter what they tried, Ethan's heart refused to start again. Marcos glanced at the clock, then at Daniel. Protocol required a time of death. A decision. Daniel felt it like a weight pressing on his chest. He looked back down at Ethan's still face, at the small scar on his chin, at the faint stubble on his jaw. 20-something. Too young. Too much life that would never be lived. He heard the mother crying. He heard the brother whispering, "No, no, no." "Daniel," Marcos said quietly. "We've been at it for a long time." Daniel swallowed, throat dry. He looked again at the monitor. Nothing. He knew what needed to be done. He had pronounced deaths before. He had said the words. But something in him resisted this moment with an intensity that surprised him. He felt, irrationally, like if he just pushed harder, just one more time, something might change. But it didn't. Finally, he took a breath that trembled just enough for him to notice it. He stopped compressions. The room seemed to exhale with him, falling into a strange, heavy silence. He checked for a pulse, knowing he wouldn't find one. Then, in a voice that felt like it belonged to someone else, he said the time. The mother made a sound that was more like an animal's cry than a human one. She crumpled to the floor beside her son, clutching his arm, pressing her forehead against his chest. The brother stood frozen, eyes wide, then staggered back, knocking into the coffee table. A mug shattered on the floor, the sound jolting in the quiet room. "No," the brother whispered. "You're wrong. You're wrong. You can't just stop. Keep going. You're supposed to save him. That's your job." Daniel felt the words like blows. He wanted to say something, anything, that would make this less unbearable. "I'm sorry," he managed. "We did everything we—" "Don't say that," the brother snapped, tears streaking his face. "Don't say you did everything. You got here too late. You could have done more. You should have done more." His voice cracked on the last word. Marcos stepped in, speaking softly, explaining. trying to offer whatever thin comfort could exist in a moment like that. Daniel just stood there, hands heavy at his sides, gloves sticky, eyes fixed on Ethan's face. He felt like he had failed in the most fundamental way a person in his position could fail. Later, after paperwork and protocols and silence in the back of the ambulance, Daniel sat in the break room at the station, staring at the vending machine. He could still hear the brother's words. "You could have done more. You should have done more." He replayed the call in his head, the response time, the interventions, the sequence of events. He thought about every decision, every moment he hesitated, every second that passed between compressions and shocks. He knew, logically, that sometimes it didn't matter, that some hearts simply didn't come back, that time and biology and the hidden details of someone's health could outweigh even the best efforts. But logic didn't matter much when the image of a mother collapsing over her son's body haunted every blink. He didn't sleep that day, or the next night, or the one after that. In the weeks that followed, Daniel began to notice a shift. Calls that once flooded him with adrenaline now filled him with dread. He second-guessed himself on scene. He double-checked everything, then checked again, even when there was no reason to. The confidence that used to guide his hands had been replaced by a constant, gnawing question. What if I miss something again? What if I fail someone else? Every time he heard cardiac arrest on the radio, his chest tightened. Sometimes, just hearing a mother's voice on the phone in the background of a call report made his hands shake. One afternoon, after another shift that left him feeling like a ghost in his own body, he stood in the locker room staring at his uniform on the bench. He realized he didn't want to put it on anymore. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much, and the weight of that care had become unbearable. He quit a few weeks later. He didn't tell his colleagues the whole truth. He mumbled something about needing a change, about stress, about wanting to try something new. They patted his shoulder, told him he'd always be one of them, said he could come back any time. He smiled, made promises he knew he wouldn't keep, and turned in his badge. The city kept moving. The sirens kept wailing. Someone else sat where he used to sit in the ambulance. He tried other jobs, warehouse work, delivery, some shifts at a hardware store. Physical work that kept his hands busy and his mind, at least for a few hours a day, quiet. But the nights were long. The guilt didn't just disappear with a uniform. He thought about therapy more than once, even picked up the phone and started dialing a number a colleague had given him. Each time, he hung up before it connected. How was he supposed to tell a stranger that he had failed a young man in front of his own family? That he had decided, because that's how it felt, to stop trying? Years passed. The sharp edges of the memory dulled slightly, but the weight remained. A part of him stayed in that living room, listening to a mother's sobs and a brother's accusation. Back in the cafe in the present, Daniel took another sip of coffee. Outside, the rain had softened to a mist. A group of students hurried past, laughing as they held jackets over their heads. Inside, a mellow song played over the speakers, soft enough to fade into the background. He didn't notice the man who had walked in a few minutes earlier. The man looked to be in his early 30s, dressed in a simple jacket and jeans. His hair was slightly damp from the weather, dark strands curling at the ends. He stood in line, ordered his drink, gave his name, Aaron, and then turned to scan the cafe for a place to sit. His gaze swept the room, passing over the students, the woman with the book, the person on the laptop, and then landed on Daniel. For a moment, nothing. Just two strangers in a cafe, eyes meeting briefly. But then, something flickered in Aaron's expression. A tiny spark of recognition, quickly followed by confusion. He frowned slightly, as if trying to place a face he hadn't expected to see outside of a memory. He took his coffee when it was ready, then hesitated, still looking in Daniel's direction. He didn't walk over immediately. He sat at a nearby table instead, angled just enough that he could see Daniel out of the corner of his eye. He stirred his drink, tapping the spoon against the cup, mind racing. Where do I know him from? The jawline, the way he held himself. There was something familiar there, but out of context it was slippery. Years had passed. Time had a way of blurring edges. Daniel, unaware, continued staring out the window, lost in whatever quiet battle he was fighting with his thoughts. Aaron's mind flashed back, unbidden, to a night years ago. Rain on the windows, blue and red lights flashing outside his home. The sound of sirens fading as the ambulance pulled away empty, leaving behind a silence that felt like a wound. He remembered faces from that night, but not clearly. Everything had been chaos. He remembered a man kneeling over Ethan, pushing on his chest, calling his name. He remembered angry words spilling from his own mouth, words he regretted and yet couldn't take back. He remembered one detail very clearly, though, the paramedic's name. It had appeared later, printed in a short article about emergency response times and efforts made on scene. He had read it again and again, fingers tracing each letter. Daniel Reed. In the cafe, Aaron watched as the barista called out another order. "Daniel! Cappuccino for Daniel!" The man by the window looked up. Not the same Daniel, Aaron thought at first. It couldn't be. The city was big. Names repeated. Coincidences happened. But the more he watched, the more the pieces shifted into place. The tired eyes. The way his shoulders hunched slightly, as if carrying something far heavier than a cup of coffee. The faint profile he remembered from a blur of lights and panic. His heart began to pound. He took a slow breath and forced himself to be still. He knew better than to leap to conclusions. People made mistakes when they rushed into things fueled by emotion and fragmented memories. But still, he set his coffee down, stared at it for a moment, then looked back at Daniel. He decided that he needed to know. After a minute of wrestling with his own nerves, he stood up, walked to the counter, and approached the barista. "Hey," he said quietly, trying to sound casual. "Sorry, quick question. The guy by the window, what name did he give you for his order?" The barista looked at him, then at Daniel, then back at him. "Daniel," she said. "Why?" Aaron exhaled, barely audible. "No reason. Just thought I heard wrong." He thanked her and walked back toward his table, but changed direction halfway and approached Daniel's instead. "Excuse me," he said. Daniel looked up, blinking as if pulled from far away. He saw a man standing there, holding a coffee cup, expression caught between uncertainty and something else Daniel couldn't read yet. "Yeah?" Daniel replied, polite but guarded. Sorry to bother you," the man said. "This is going to sound strange, but is your name Daniel? Daniel Reed?" The name hung in the air like a weight. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly around his cup. He wasn't used to strangers knowing his last name. He studied the man's face. There was something familiar there, too. Something he couldn't immediately place, like a note in a song he had heard long ago. "Yeah," Daniel said slowly. "That's me. Do we know each other?" Aaron swallowed. His throat felt dry. "My name is Aaron," he said. "Aaron Cole." The surname hit Daniel like a sudden drop on a roller coaster. Cole. His mind snapped instantly back to that night. The dispatch address, the paperwork, the section for patient information. Ethan Cole. He remembered signing his own name under a line that indicated time of death. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Daniel's instinctive reaction was denial. It couldn't be. What were the odds? The city was big. But then he looked at Aaron's face again. The resemblance, the eyes, the shape of the mouth. It was like seeing Ethan older, alive, standing in front of him. "You're," Daniel began, then stopped, his voice catching. "You're Ethan's brother." "Twin," Aaron said softly. "Yeah." Silence settled between them, thick and almost electric. Daniel felt his heartbeat in his ears. The cup in his hand suddenly felt too light, too fragile. He set it down carefully, as if any sudden movement might shatter more than just ceramic. "I remember you," Aaron said. His voice was steady, but his fingers clenched slightly around his coffee. "From that night." "I remember you too," Daniel replied quietly. "And your mom. I remember everything." They stood like that for a moment. Two men who had shared the worst night of their lives and then gone in opposite directions, suddenly pulled back into the same orbit. "Can I sit?" Aaron asked. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because he wanted to refuse, but because he was afraid. Afraid of what this conversation might surface. Afraid of hearing again that he could have done more, should have done more. "Yeah," Daniel said. "Of course." Aaron sat down across from him, placing his cup on the table. The cafe's quiet hum continued around them, but to Daniel it felt distant, like the background noise of a different world. Up close, the resemblance to Ethan was even stronger. It was like time had folded, bringing the past into the present so sharply that Daniel almost had trouble breathing. How are you?" Daniel asked, the question inadequate and small, but all he could manage. Aaron let out a short, humorless breath. "That's a big question," he said. "But I'm here. I'm okay. Some days more than others." He studied Daniel's face. "What about you?" Daniel stared at his hands for a moment. "I'm here," he echoed. "I get through the days, one at a time." Aaron nodded slowly, as if that answer made more sense than any polished, rehearsed response would have. They sat in another stretch of silence, the kind that isn't empty, but heavy with unasked questions. "So," Aaron said finally, voice careful, "do you still work as a paramedic?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He looked up and met Aaron's eyes. "No," he said. "I quit. Not long after that night." Something flickered across Aaron's face. Surprise, maybe, or something gentler. He took a sip of his coffee, buying himself a second to process. "Because of Ethan?" he asked quietly. Daniel swallowed hard. "Yes," he said. There was no point in pretending otherwise. "Because of Ethan, because of that call, because I couldn't carry what happened. Not the way I was supposed to." He expected anger, accusation. You should have felt that way. You should feel guilty. But Aaron only watched him, his expression complicated. "For a long time," Aaron said slowly, "I blamed you too." The words landed like a familiar punch, but somehow less sharp than they had in Daniel's nightmares. At least this time they were spoken calmly, without the raw rage of fresh grief. "I know," Daniel said, voice low. "You said it, that night, and I heard you, every word, over and over for years." Aaron closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again, gaze steady. "I was angry at everyone," he said. "At you, at the hospital staff, at my parents, at myself, at Ethan, at God, if I'm honest. It was easier than accepting that sometimes things just happen and there's no one clear to blame." He shook his head slightly, as if trying to dislodge an old thought. "I remember reading the incident report later," he continued. "I don't know how my dad got it. Something through the hospital, I think. Your name was there. Time of arrival. Procedures performed. Medication doses. It was all very technical. Very clean, like they managed to turn the worst moment of our lives into bullet points." Daniel nodded slightly. He knew those reports. He had written many. "I must have read it 50 times, Aaron said, looking for mistakes, looking for some line that would prove I was right to be angry at you. But it all sounded right, at least what I could understand." He paused, studying Daniel. "I didn't know you quit," Aaron said. "I always assumed you just went on with your life. That it was just another call for you. One of many. Daniel shook his head, letting out a soft, bitter exhale. It was not just another call, he said. I remember every detail of that night. The route we took. The color of your living room walls. The mug that fell and broke when you backed into the table. Your mother's voice. Your voice. His throat tightened. He swallowed. I still dream about it, he added quietly. Less now than before. But it's still there. Aaron listened, and as he did, something in him shifted. He had lived for years with his own version of that night, replayed again and again through the lens of a grieving brother. Now, seeing the toll it had taken on this man in front of him, he realized he had never truly considered that someone on the other side of that doorway might have been broken by it too. He leaned forward slightly. Why did you quit exactly? He asked. I mean, I get that it was because of Ethan. But what was it for you? What changed? Daniel rubbed his thumb along the edge of the cup, eyes fixed there. Before that night, he said, I believed that as long as I did everything right, I could live with losing people. I knew in theory that we couldn't save everyone. They teach you that. They tell you the statistics. But I had this quiet deal I made with myself. If I stayed sharp, if I followed protocol, if I gave everything I had, I'd be able to sleep at night, even when we couldn't turn things around. He exhaled slowly. That night broke that deal, he continued, because I did everything we could. I know we did, but it still wasn't enough. And then I saw your face, your mother's. I heard what you said, and I started thinking, what if you were right? What if there was something else I should have done? Some angle I missed, some call I made too late. I replayed every second, every single second. It never stopped. He met Aaron's eyes, and there was no bravado there, no shield, just exhaustion and something like quiet shame. The next time I went on a call, Daniel said, my hands shook. I double-checked everything, triple-checked. I started to freeze up when I had to make quick decisions because I could hear this voice in my head saying, if you get this wrong, you'll ruin another family. And that's not what you want from someone who has to make split-second choices to save lives. He shook his head slightly. It got to the point where the fear of failing someone else was bigger than the hope of saving them, he admitted. And that's dangerous. For the patients, for the team, for me. So I left. Aaron absorbed that in silence. Did anyone know, Aaron asked after a moment, that you were going through that? Your colleagues? Family? Daniel gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. I'm not great at talking about things like this, he said. I told them it was stress, burnout, which wasn't exactly a lie. But I didn't tell them that it all centered on one call, one person, one family. He hesitated. I didn't think I had the right to talk about my pain, he added quietly. Not when you'd lost your brother. It felt, selfish. Like who was I to be struggling when I could still go home at the end of the shift? Aaron's eyes softened. He hadn't expected that answer. He had spent so long seeing that night only from his own side that he hadn't imagined the possibility that the paramedic had walked away, carrying a different kind of loss. You know, Aaron said slowly, I used to think that first responders, I don't know, were used to losing people, that it hurt. But they had this emotional armor, like it rolled off them somehow because they saw it so often. Daniel let out a soft, humorless laugh. Some people try to build that, he said. Jokes in the ambulance, dark humor at the station. You tell yourself it's the only way to cope. But it's not armor. It's more like a thin coat in a storm. The rain still gets through. He looked out the window for a moment, watching a car splash through a puddle. The truth is, he continued, We see people on the worst day of their lives. Sometimes the last day. We see the rawest grief, the ugliest fear, the moments most people never witness. You can't walk away from that untouched. Some of us carry it better than others, I guess. Some of us don't. Silence lingered again, but it felt different now. Less like a wall and more like a shared shelter. I had no idea, Aaron admitted. How could you? Daniel replied gently. That night, you were in your own storm. You weren't supposed to think about the paramedic's feelings. Aaron looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers as if trying to release tension that had been there for years. It's strange, he said. For so long, I avoided talking about that night. My parents and I, we never really processed it together. It was like we each went into our own separate rooms and closed the door. Sometimes I'd hear my mom crying in the middle of the night and I'd just freeze. I didn't know what to do. He paused, then glanced at Daniel. You were there for an hour, maybe, Aaron said. But in my head, you became this figure, this symbol, the guy who lost my brother, the guy who gave up, the guy who walked out and got to go home afterward. You were easier to focus on than the randomness of what happened. Easier to blame you than to accept that we might have missed signs, or that Ethan might have had something no one knew about. His voice softened. It's weird to sit here and realize you've been a person this whole time, Aaron added. Living with your own version of that night. Daniel's jaw clenched and then released. I'm sorry, Daniel said quietly. For what I couldn't do. For what you went through. I've wanted to say that out loud to you for years, even though I never thought I'd get the chance. Aaron looked at him. Really looked. And in that moment he saw not just the man from his worst memory, but a fragile, flawed human being carrying something too heavy for one person to hold. Can I ask you something? Aaron said. Yeah, Daniel replied. Was there anything you think you missed? Aaron asked. Be honest. I can handle it. At least I think I can. I've made peace with a lot of things since then. But I've always wondered. Daniel took a deep breath. It was a question he had asked himself countless times. It felt almost like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that whatever he said would change something, for one or both of them. I've gone over that night in my head so many times, he said. From the moment we got the call to the moment we left your house. I've talked about it with a doctor friend, gone through the timeline. The truth is, from a medical standpoint, with what we had and the time that had already passed, we followed protocol. We did what we were supposed to do. He paused, then added more softly. But that doesn't mean I don't still ask myself if I could have done something just a little bit faster. 1 minute quicker on scene. 1 fewer second between compressions and the first shock. I don't think there was a magic move that would have saved him. But guilt doesn't really care about logic. Aaron nodded slowly. There was something painful and yet freeing in hearing that. It didn't give him a neat answer. It didn't offer a miracle. It simply acknowledged the messy truth. They had all been human in a moment where they had desperately needed certainty. I used to obsess over the what-ifs too, Aaron said. What if we had called sooner? What if I had noticed something was wrong earlier that week? He mentioned feeling tired, but we both laughed it off. We were young. We thought we were invincible. He swallowed. I found out later that there was a heart condition in the family that no one had really talked about much, Aaron continued. My grandfather died suddenly in his 40s. They called it a heart attack, but there were hints it was something else. No one pushed for more tests. No one connected the dots. By the time we knew, it was too late for Ethan. Daniel's eyes widened slightly. I didn't know that. Aaron gave a small shrug. We didn't either, he said. Not really. Not in a way that made us act. And for a long time, that made me angry too. Angry at my family for keeping quiet. Angry at myself for not asking more questions. But what good did that anger do? It didn't bring him back. It just Kept me from living fully for a while. He looked at Daniel again, more gently now. I'm not saying this to absolve anyone, Aaron said. But I don't think you were the one who lost my brother. I think life pieces together a chain of events sometimes that no one person can control. You were just at the end of that chain. Daniel's shoulders sagged slightly, as if some invisible weight had shifted just enough for him to notice the difference. I don't know how to accept that, he admitted. I've built my entire story around the idea that I failed. It's hard to let go of a story you've rehearsed for years, even if it hurts you. Aaron thought about that for a moment. Have you ever talked to someone about it? He asked. Like, properly? Not just in your own head? Daniel gave a tired smile. Not like this, he said. Not with someone who was there. Not with someone who has as much right to judge me as you do. Aaron exhaled, then leaned forward slightly. I don't want to judge you, he said. I thought I did. For a long time I held on to that anger like it was the only thread connecting me to Ethan. But I've learned something over the years. Holding on to blame doesn't honor the person you lost. It just keeps you chained to the moment they left. He glanced at his coffee, then back at Daniel. Can I tell you something strange? Aaron asked. Yeah. In a way, Aaron said. I'm glad you're not still working as a paramedic, not because you were bad at it. On the contrary, I remember how hard you worked that night. But because, if you were still doing it while carrying this much guilt, it would probably be killing you slowly. And I don't think my brother would want that. Daniel's breath caught. What do you mean? He asked quietly. Ethan was the kind of person who always worried about other people, Aaron said, a faint smile touching his lips at the memory. He was the guy who'd stay late to help a coworker, who'd give his hoodie to someone who was cold. If he knew that his death had been haunting you like this, he'd probably tell you to stop, to let go, to forgive yourself, even if you don't think you deserve it. He paused, voice softening. In fact, Aaron added, I think if he could say something to you, it would be, thank you for trying. I really believe that. The words settled into the space between them, simple and yet carrying more weight than anything else said that day. Daniel felt a tightness in his chest that had been there for years begin just slightly to loosen. His eyes stung, and for a second he had to look away, focusing on a tiny scratch on the table's surface. I don't know what to do with that, he whispered. Thank you for trying. It feels too kind. I never imagined that's something anyone from your family might say to me. Aaron's expression softened further. You're not the villain in our story, Daniel, he said. You were one of the people who ran toward us when everything was falling apart. You didn't run away. You walked into our living room and did your best when the rest of us were losing our minds. That counts for something. A lot, actually. Daniel's jaw trembled, just slightly. I wish my best had been enough, he said. So do I, Aaron replied. Every single day. But I've had to learn to live in a world where it wasn't. And in that world, I'd rather remember you as someone who fought for my brother than as someone I hate for not saving him. They sat in silence again, but this time it felt almost tender. Two versions of the past slowly aligning into something more bearable. Do your parents still hold on to anger? Daniel asked cautiously. Aaron shook his head. Not like before, he said. Time doesn't fix everything, but it changes the shape of pain. My mom went to a support group for a while. My dad started gardening, of all things. They talk about Ethan more now than they did in the years right after. The anger has been replaced by something else. Sadness. Love. Gratitude for the years we had, even if they were fewer than we wanted. He looked at Daniel. I never told them I blamed you, Aaron admitted. Not like that. I didn't want to add fuel to the fire. But I did tell them about the report, about how you did CPR for so long, how you kept going. My mom said something then that I think you should hear." Daniel's chest tightened again. "What did she say?" he asked. "She said," Aaron recalled, "that she would always be grateful that there were people like you who show up when mothers call and say, 'Please help my child.' Even if it doesn't end the way we hope," she said. "At least he wasn't alone. At least someone fought for him until the end." He let the words sink in. "And that's what you did," Aaron added quietly. "You made sure he wasn't alone." Daniel looked away, blinking rapidly. He didn't fight the tears this time. One slipped out, then another, and he let them fall. "I've spent so long thinking about what I couldn't do," he said, voice thick. "I never let myself think that maybe what I did do mattered in some way." "It mattered," Aaron said firmly. "More than you think." For a while they said nothing. The cafe moved on around them. Cups clinked. A coffee grinder whirred. Someone laughed softly a few tables over. Life, indifferent and continuous, wrapped itself around their small island of shared grief and gradual healing. When Daniel finally spoke again, his voice was calmer. "What about you?" he asked. "How did you keep going?" Aaron gave a small, almost surprised laugh. "Not gracefully," he admitted. "At first I tried to pretend I was fine. I threw myself into work, stayed out late, avoided any place or thing that reminded me of Ethan. Which, as you can imagine, is hard when your twin has been part of every corner of your life." He exhaled. "I had panic attacks for a while," he continued. "Couldn't go into small spaces. The night of his death, when the room felt so crowded with people and equipment and fear, something in me just snapped. For months, every time I felt trapped, my chest would tighten. It took therapy to understand that was my body remembering." He glanced at Daniel. "You know what finally made a difference?" Aaron said. "Hearing other people's stories. Realizing I wasn't the only one whose life had been split into before and after by a single phone call. I went to a group where people talked about their losses, spouses, parents, friends. It was brutal, but it was also weirdly comforting. We were all walking around with invisible wounds. Sharing them made them less isolating." Daniel listened intently. "I've thought about going to something like that," Daniel said. "But for responders, I've heard there are groups, places where paramedics, firefighters, nurses talk about the ones they couldn't save. I always told myself I didn't deserve to be there, that my pain didn't count the same way." "It counts," Aaron said softly. "Pain doesn't have a limited quota. Yours doesn't cancel out mine. Mine doesn't cancel out yours. We're both allowed to hurt, and we're both allowed to heal." Daniel met his eyes and nodded slowly, as if trying on the idea. "You know," Aaron added, "sometimes what we need isn't someone to say, 'It's not your fault,' or 'You did everything right.' Sometimes what we need is someone to say, 'Yeah, it hurts. Yeah, it changed you, and you're not alone in that.'" He gave a small smile. "That's what you're giving me right now," Aaron said, "and I hope I'm giving you a bit of that too." "You are," Daniel said. The words came out simple and honest. "More than you know." They talked for a long time after that. About Ethan. What he was like as a kid. The pranks he played. The music he loved. About the small things Daniel remembered from that night that Aaron had never known. Like the way Ethan's hand had felt warm at first beneath Daniel's gloved fingers. How Daniel had kept speaking his name, hoping on some level that something in Ethan's mind might be listening. They talked about guilt, how it creeps in at the edges of tragedy and whispers that you could have changed the ending if you had just done one thing differently. How it nests in the quiet moments. How it can shape a life if you let it. They talked about first responders, the invisible load they carry, the way they move from one crisis to the next without time to process what they've just seen. The way people sometimes expect them to be unshakable, forgetting that they are human beings with limits. And gradually, the conversation shifted. It moved from the sharp pain of the past to the softer questions of the future. "Do you ever think about going back?" Aaron asked at one point. "To being a paramedic, I mean." Daniel thought about it, really thought about it. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Not because I think I owe it to anyone. I've let go of that, at least a little. But because there was a time when it made me feel like I was part of something bigger, like I had a purpose. I miss that. But I also know that if I ever did go back, it would have to be from a different place. Not from guilt. From choice." Aaron nodded. "Maybe there are other ways to use what you've been through," he suggested. "Training, teaching, talking to new recruits about the emotional side of the job, helping them understand that it's okay to feel, that they don't have to carry it alone." Daniel considered that, the idea settling into him like a seed. "I've never thought about that," he said. "I always assumed my story was something to be ashamed of, not something that could help anyone." "Maybe that's the redemption in all this," Aaron said. "Not erasing what happened, not pretending it didn't hurt you, but using the scar to guide others, so that when they inevitably face their own Ethan, they'll know it's okay to ask for help afterward." The word redemption lingered. "Do you think I deserve that?" Daniel asked. It wasn't a dramatic question, just an honest one. Aaron looked at him steadily. "I think we all deserve a chance to be more than the worst moment we've lived," he said. "You, me, my parents, everyone. What you did that night doesn't define the rest of your life unless you let it." He paused. "And for what it's worth," Aaron added, voice steady, "I forgive you." The words were simple. They didn't change the past. They didn't bring Ethan back. They didn't magically erase years of guilt or grief. But they did something else. They opened a door. Daniel's breath hitched. He closed his eyes for a moment, and in the darkness behind his eyelids he saw Ethan's face, the living room, the monitor, the flat line. Then, slowly, those images faded, replaced by the present. The warmth of the coffee cup under his hands, the quiet murmur of the cafe, Aaron sitting across from him with eyes that held both pain and peace. "Thank you," Daniel said. His voice was barely more than a whisper, but it carried everything he didn't know how to put into words. They stayed there until the afternoon light shifted, and the cafe lamps glowed a little brighter. When they finally stood to leave, the air outside had grown cooler, the rain long gone, the sky cracked open just enough to reveal a strip of soft, fading blue. They stepped onto the sidewalk together. "Can I ask you one more thing?" Daniel said, hands in his jacket pockets. "Sure," Aaron replied. "If you could go back to that night," Daniel said, "and talk to yourself, to the version of you watching us work on your brother, what would you say?" Aaron thought about it. Really took a moment. "I'd tell him to breathe," Aaron said slowly. "To remember that he's still alive. That as much as it hurts, he's going to carry both grief and love for a long time, and that's okay. I'd tell him that blaming someone might feel easier in the beginning, but it won't heal him. I'd tell him that one day he'll sit across from the paramedic he yelled at and realize they were both just two scared humans doing their best in a moment that none of them were ready for." He looked at Daniel. "And maybe," Aaron added, "I'd tell him to say thank you instead of, 'You should have done more,' even if he's not ready to mean it yet." Daniel let out a soft, shaky exhale that might have been a laugh if it weren't so full of emotion. "What about you?" Aaron asked. "What would you say to yourself, the version of you walking out of our house that night?" Daniel looked down the street, watching the flow of people and cars, the everyday life that kept moving regardless of individual storms. "I'd tell him that he's not a monster," Daniel said. "That he didn't fail because he cared. That this one call will try to convince him he's not good enough, not strong enough, not worthy of the uniform he wears. I'd tell him that leaving the job doesn't make him a coward. It makes him human, and that someday he'll have a chance, sitting in a cafe of all places, to see that he wasn't the only one wounded that night, and that something good can still grow out of that pain. He paused, and I'd tell him to get help sooner, Daniel added, to talk, to not carry it alone for so long. Aaron nodded, satisfied with that answer. They exchanged numbers before parting, not with promises of constant contact or forced friendship, but with the quiet understanding that they shared something no one else could fully understand. "If you ever want to talk," Aaron said, "about Ethan, about that night, about anything, you can call." "You too," Daniel replied. "If you ever need the perspective of someone who was on the other side of that door." They smiled, small but real. Then they turned in opposite directions, each carrying something new. For Daniel, a lighter kind of weight. For Aaron, a new layer of understanding. As Daniel walked home, his steps felt different. The city's sounds, sirens, distant and close, people talking, a dog barking, didn't jab at him with the same sharpness. The siren he heard a few blocks away still tugged at old wounds. But now, alongside the guilt, there was something else. Gratitude. Gratitude that he had been able to be there that night at all. Gratitude that he had been found, years later, in a random cafe, by the one person he had convinced himself would never want to see him again. Gratitude that the story he had been telling himself for 6 years had been challenged, softened, reshaped by someone who had every reason to hate him and chose instead to offer forgiveness. He didn't know exactly what his future would look like. He didn't know if he'd ever return to emergency work in any capacity, but for the first time in years, he felt like his life might not be permanently divided into before Ethan and after Ethan. There could be something else, something beyond. At home that evening, he opened his laptop and searched for support groups for former first responders. He found a few listings. His finger hovered over the trackpad for a long moment. Then he clicked. He sent an email. A simple one. Short. Honest. "My name is Daniel. I worked as a paramedic for 8 years. I left after a call I couldn't get past. I think I'm ready to talk about it now." He hit send before he could talk himself out of it. On the other side of the city, Aaron sat at his kitchen table, a framed photo of Ethan on the wall nearby. It showed the two of them at a birthday party years ago, laughing at something just outside the frame. For the first time in a long time, Aaron looked at the photo and didn't feel a surge of anger mixed with sorrow. He felt a deep ache, yes, and an equal measure of love. He thought about Daniel, about the way his hands had trembled when he finally allowed himself to cry, about the way his voice had shifted when he spoke of feeling unworthy of forgiveness, about the quiet relief in his eyes when he heard that he was not the villain of the story. Aaron stood, walked over to the photo, and touched the frame. "You'd have liked him," he murmured to his brother. "You really would have. Somewhere between grief and forgiveness, between guilt and healing. 2 lives that had once collided in tragedy now began to move forward, separately yet connected by something invisible and real. Because sometimes, redemption doesn't come in grand gestures or perfect closures. It arrives at a small table in a quiet cafe, in the form of a conversation neither person planned for. It shows up when someone chooses to listen instead of accuse, to understand instead of condemn. It grows in the space where pain is finally spoken and shared. And if this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of your own invisible battles, or the weight of a moment that changed your life, let it be a gentle invitation. An invitation to look with a little more kindness at the people who run toward our emergencies. To remember that behind every uniform there is a person who goes home carrying the echoes of cries and sirens. An invitation, too, to offer yourself the same grace you might offer them. To accept that being human means sometimes breaking under the weight, and sometimes, slowly, learning how to stand again. If you've ever lost someone, or ever felt crushed by guilt for something you couldn't change, know that you are not alone. Your story matters, your pain matters, and your healing, however slow and uneven, matters just as much. If you feel comfortable, share a bit of your story in the comments. You never know who might need to read that they're not the only one. And if you'd like to keep walking through stories like this, stories of fragile courage, quiet redemption, and the hidden hearts of ordinary people, consider subscribing to this channel. Here, every story is an attempt to hold a little light to the darker corners of our lives, so that none of us have to face them entirely on our own.